Okay, now I've started recording. These folks for this week are the Methodists, and they're called Methodists, uh, and that ties back to our study of the Protestant Reformation in Europe. That's one of the reasons I wanted you to kind of have a sense of what happened in the Protestant Reformation in Europe. Although that was Europe, it was primarily a white European experience, almost 100%. But it ties into, now you'll see how that ties into what has become a predominantly Black experience in America. And one of those general themes is Methodists, or Methodism. So where does the word Methodist come from, and who was involved in its getting started?
Well, we do know that John Wesley was one of the main focuses on getting it started.
Right? Yep. Where was John?
Uh,
What country?
England.
Yeah. Okay, that's the, so you got to place Wesley in England, and about a couple of hundred years after the Reformation. What denomination of English religion was he? Somebody else besides Walter. What was Wesley's religious affiliation?
Hold on here.
Because there wasn't anything called Methodist at that time, and they really didn't become called Methodists until lots later.
Um,
So was he Catholic?
I have Anglican.
Yes, he was an Anglican. Or what do we call the Anglicans in this country? Starts with an E.
Episcopalian?
Episcopal, yeah, right. So the Anglicans and Episcopalians is the same basic type of church. In England, they call them Anglicans, which just means they're English religious people. And in America, they're called Episcopal because they're ruled by bishops. The word episkopos is the Greek word for bishop. They have bishops. They're not the only denomination that has bishops, but that's the name they took for themselves. Okay. So Wesley was a good Anglican. How did he turn out to be something? How did he come up with this different movement that he called Methodism? What happened to him? Nobody remembers that one? So he was at a meeting of people, a prayer meeting, and he said, my heart was strangely warmed. And that's a distinct contrast between the very formal, high, holy liturgies of the Episcopal Church, which is very formal and very set, routine. They always pretty much sing the same stuff and recite the same prayers year after year. But all of a sudden, this emotional connection with his religion that he hadn't had before. And he decided that he wanted to help other people to have this sense of how wonderful it is to be a Christian and how to use that to develop one's personal growth as a disciple of Jesus. And what did he call that way of becoming emotionally connected with Jesus?
In America here?
Yeah, what did he call it at that time, even in England?
Oh, because I know here.
It's a very simple thing. He called it a method.
Mm.
Here's the method of getting to that sense of really real emotional connection with Jesus in the Christian faith. And then that was because then it became called Methodism. Then that spread to America. He and his brother came to America to preach some, and that kind of spread from there. So how did Black folks get engaged with Methodists in America? That starts on page 27 on Tin and Pin. And why did they become Methodists?
From what I briefly have on it, Blacks preferred it to the other religions of that time because it gave them more freedom to worship.
Right.
It was very emotional for them, where they felt free.
Yeah. 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 It gave them a sense of being more in charge of their own faith rather than having to do and believe just exactly the way the white folks told them to do and believe. Right. Exactly. And Methodist churches welcomed them, particularly in the North at that point. Now, there's one other name you need to remember. Who was the first American leader of the Methodist Church, not after Wesley? He's mentioned all through that section before on 20, 24, 25, 26, and so forth.
I have several names, Danny. I just want to make sure. Yeah.
Well, he was the first bishop of the Methodist Church in America. Evangelist. There is a seminary in Kentucky named after him, in fact.
Would it be
Is it John Wesley?
Yes. No, it's not Wesley. Wesley was the founder, but he he didn't stay in America.
Whitefield?
What?
Maybe Whitefields?
No, he preached a lot in the Great Awakening, but
okay.
Is this no, never mind.
Let's see what.
So on the bottom of page 26, this guy is talked about specifically when he was the leader that formed the Methodist Episcopal Church in 1784.
Yeah, Asbury.
Yeah, Francis Asbury. All right.
How come I see Asbury? Okay, here he is.
Yeah. And Asbury was a pretty good guy, apparently. He was a good leader. He helped expand it. He helped set up the circuits. They had lots of churches and not many preachers. So the preachers would have many churches they would go to that ride the circuits on their horses. So there's they called them itinerant preachers. He also encouraged the spread of Methodism into other areas. He also encouraged Black folks to become parts of the Methodist churches.
Okay, because further down the road, I'm going through my notes. I think he is the first that was to ordain the Black ministers of the Methodist Church.
Right. So what was it now? So now we come to the crux of the deal. So the Black folks were in the main Methodist churches that's in the North. There was one big one in Philadelphia that became the start of the AME Church. There was another one in New York that was part of the start of the AME Zion Church. But the white church had black folks there, and then what happened that caused the black folks to say, we're not staying here at that church in Philadelphia?
They felt that since they were free slaves at that time.
Yeah, so it's the North. They're freed slaves.
Yeah, that they were free slaves. That why were they still being treated as slaves, where they had to sit up in the balconies, they had to be last for communion,
right,
or last in prayer, considering that over 75% of the church was all black.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And there's they tell a story in there about the specific event that caused them to say, we've had it. It was during worship. And what the name of that church in Philadelphia?
Where is it? What is it? What is it? What is it?
Is it? Oh shoot.
On page 31, it starts talking about, and picture Richard Allen on that page.
All right.
And the story is on 32, and the inset, the incident.
Okay, St. George Methodist Episcopal.
Yeah. You see that paragraph on 32. This is a memorable story that is basically is the heart and the crux of why black folks decided they could no longer worship in the predominantly white churches.
That was in that conference the other night in the Louisville Seminary also.
Yeah. Oh yeah, everybody talks about that specific story. Right.
They were denied prayer according to what this is said. That's why I was telling you, the amount of information I got from this,
yeah,
it's a lot of things in one that I did not find in the other. Because in Pen and Pen, they state this was mainly because being denied prayer, and Richard Allen and Absalom, where are you at? So many notes. So Absalom, they led the congregation out of the church.
Absalom and Jones, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and began to form their own church. I think it was called the Bethel African Methodist Church.
Right.
So
what exactly happened that day when they was denied being in prayer? That there's a very specific event that's worth remembering here.
They were physically prevented from prayer.
Yeah, and that meant, what did they do to them?
They were just restrained or either manhandled from going down to the altar.
Well, they were all kneeling in prayer in the sanctuary. And while they're in the middle of the prayer and everybody's praying, and particularly these two black preachers were kneeling in prayer, and a white usher came up to him, or elder came up to him and started yanking him up and say, "You can't pray here. You got to go upstairs."
Oh, okay.
That's all. That's all they did. Does this sound familiar? Pulling him off his knees and saying, "You must get up. You must not kneel here." And then, as you said, Walter, they all got up, the black folks all got up and walked out.
Mm.
Right.
And then you had the two court cases that they had to fight through. But the one thing I found in Britannica that I didn't find in Pen and Pen, and I couldn't find much information on it. The church after Francis and Ashbury had consecrated Bishop Allen for the church. I found some names, but I couldn't find them in Pen and Pen, and couldn't find much information on them. It was William Paul Quinn, Daniel Payne, and Henry Turner, and how they were saying that along with Richard Allen, they helped influence this movement in the church.
I see the list on page 34, and there's Henry McNeil Turner's name. There's Benjamin Arnett, that's later. So they don't have all the names in here. Basically, what Pen and Pen have done is what I'm asking you is they've boiled it down to the things that they think are really most important to remember.
Okay.
So, and you mentioned the name of the church that they formed with Bishop Asbury's blessing was the Bethel Church in 1794.
Right.
And they ordained Richard Allen as the pastor elder of that church. On page 33, then the black Methodist Episcopal Church continued to grow. They were supervised by Francis Asbury. They were connected up with the other white churches. And finally, in the year 1816, at the top of the first paragraph, they created the new denomination they had a conference, the new denomination in Philadelphia, the AME Church, African Methodist Episcopal Church. So if you're going to remember anything about this process, you need to remember that it came from Wesleyan Methodism, that Francis Asbury was the bishop that started spreading Methodism in general. Black folks were joined the church and were invited to be part of the white churches because that's all they had at that point. And then they were no longer welcome in the white churches. And that was probably because there were getting to be too many of them, and the poor, fragile white folks were getting threatened by black folks taking over their church, is my guess. Doesn't say that, but it doesn't take much imagination to figure that one out.
Well, because in one part of the research I did, it said that the Methodist Episcopal Church and the Methodist Episcopal Church of the South, like you said, they felt threatened by the number of blacks being in the church. And so the church formed a different denomination in 1870 called the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church.
Yeah, that's the third piece of this chapter. So that's the black denomination number 3. Black denomination number 1 is the African Methodist Episcopal Church, period. The second one, which started in New York City, a very similar story, and they were part of a church that was, let's see if I can remember, that starts on page 44. They were at the John Street Methodist Episcopal Church, white church in New York City, and they had so many people that they had to push the blacks out into the segregated areas, and the blacks finally said, you know, as you said, Walter, they weren't allowed to take communion at the same time. They weren't allowed to say prayers at the same time, and so they formed their own church, which they called the Zion Church, and then later on they developed with the blessing of Francis Asbury, the AME Zion denomination, just partly because they were two different parts of the country, Philadelphia and New York, and in those days that's farther apart.
I couldn't find too much information on one because I said I wanted to ask you about it. Was the Free African Society?
Mm-hmm. That was, and that's mentioned on the bottom of page 31 in Pin and Pin.
Okay.
They were experiencing being part of St. George's Church, and they were having some problems, so they created a society, the Free African Society, as a mutual aid society, so the needs of the black folks could be met, because the white churches weren't taking care of them in terms of helping people who were in trouble, providing moral leadership and training and so forth. So that was the start, and it was out of that the AME Church and Bethel Church was formed. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
This timeline is helping a lot.
Yeah, that timeline, each one of these sections has a timeline for that denomination, and that really,
wow.
that, and then the questions and the summaries in the back at the end of each section is there.
The only thing about these ebooks is they don't give you the page number.
Oh, that's
tell
true.
you how many minutes you have left to read this. But
sorry about that. Yeah. Yeah.
The one thing I found interesting when I was talking to you last week is about how many branches of the Methodist Church there were leading from the 1800s on up. Because in one section they were talking about how the church divided into, what was it? I think about 5 or 6 different churches.
Mm-hmm.
When they heard the Methodist New Connection, the Primitive Methodists, the Bible Christians, and the United Methodist Free Church.
Are those black denominations?
They were white starting out in the beginning.
Okay.
And as it goes forward, it talks about how they all blended back into the umbrella of the Methodist Church. And then it goes to the black denominations of the Methodist Church, that how they separated at one time.
And I don't know a whole lot about that history itself. That's your research is turning up some stuff. I know from my own personal experience of being in various communities of AME churches and AME Zion churches and CME churches.
Yeah.
I'm really connected right now with CME folks because I'm participating in a research project through the Presbyterian Seminary and my congregation to connect some rural congregations, and most of them are CME, are Christian Methodist Episcopal churches.
The one curious thing I had that I wanted to ask you is, the difference between the AME Church and the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church.
Yeah. But mostly it's just it's a difference of history. I don't know, except from whatever as it says in pin what the differences are. Mm-hmm. They just started separately, and so they kept separate. The AME Zion Church came out of the John Street Church in New York City. They had different leaders, and they sort of developed somewhat different perspectives on their life together. And they called it Zion to distinguish. They didn't call it Zion immediately, but then they realized that there were the AME churches already, so they added the word Zion to distinguish themselves. Okay. And the page on page 45, it says they could have joined forces with the AME denomination, but they just decided to stay separate because they needed to have their own way of doing things, and churches get that way.
Mm-hmm.
They started their own colleges. The AME Church started a college in Ohio. What was the name of that one?
Wilberforce.
That's it, right? Wilberforce. The AME Zion folks started. Trying to think where. I don't know where that is. See it on the timeline, but it doesn't say where it is, and I lost track of that. So that'd be fun for you to look up. Anyway, their college was called. Oh, I saw that a minute ago. Livingston College. They're connected with Harriet Tubman, interestingly enough. No. They all took a while before they ordained women, as you see there. So now what's the difference between the AME and AME Zion and what was known as the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church?
That's new.
That's the third section of Pin and Pin.
I'm so sorry. This craziness keeps logging me out. I know you like, wait a minute.
It's okay. As long as I keep letting you in, you're okay. So this is there's a geographical difference between the AME and AME Zion and the CME. Where did they all mostly live at the beginning?
You talking about AME?
No, CME.
CME, okay.
Starts on page 54. I'll give you a clue. Is it the North or the South?
I'm going to say it's the South because the North was being very, organized, but it had trickled down to the South.
Yeah. So that actually in the early, I don't know when it was, but at some point the Methodist Episcopal Church split over the subject of slavery and versus freedom of slaves. So there was for a while a Methodist Episcopal Church North and a Methodist Episcopal Church South. That was also true for Presbyterians and Episcopalians and Baptists. We now still have a Southern Baptist convention. They all split over the question of whether it was okay to be Christian and own slaves. And you know, guess where they were. Well, so the Southern Methodist Episcopal Church, wanting to hold on to the black members they had, decided, it was the white denomination decided, let's start a black Methodist church here in the South. And they got people together and they decided on their church as a separate, but completely supported by and encouraged by the white Methodist Episcopal Church of the South. That's a big difference between what happened in the North and what happened in the South. And of course, if you know anything about history, the racial relations between people in the North and the South is very different. The North is ideologically more open and in favor of freedom, but there's also a very different and sense of separateness with black folks that we just assume you all keep to yourselves, right? In the South, everybody lives together, everybody works together. You work for the white folks determine most everything in the community anyway. But there is a much more amicable, if fraught, relationship between blacks and whites in the South. And so it was not as unusual then for the white church and the black church to cooperate in that way. So they called it, what was the name of that new church, new denomination?
CME.
Yeah, what did C stand for at that point?
Colored.
Colored. Yeah. Kim, you sat in on that discussion of the CME church, right? The lecture from the seminary?
Yes, I think so. Because tonight is another one. And I think that is AME.
Right.
So
did he tell you why? And you remember he said why, I sat on that one too, why they call it the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church instead of African, or, you know, nobody even thought about the word black back then.
What is it, they had more colored bishops, that there was more black ordained than in the North?
Wait a
minute.
But there was this very specifically word, they chose the word colored, and they kept the word colored in their church name up until 1956, I think.
I'm not sure what my answer, but is it to distinguish the denomination from the rest of the churches?
Well, that was part of it, but why did they pick that particular name? Because in the early 2000s, the word colored is hardly ever used. We talk about people of color, but we won't talk about calling people colored people. That's old fashioned. That's what my parents had to learn how to call the folks in our community colored instead of niggers, right? And so it was a nice term to call them colored. And the black folks of that era, according to this lecturer that Kim and I heard the other night, it was the preferred name for the black formerly enslaved folks in that era. That's what they wanted to be called. So of course they could choose that name and say, yeah, that's who we are, and that's our church. That's a very important historical piece. It was only in the 50s and 60s that we began to, the Black folks of America and with the civil rights began to say, we don't want to be called colored anymore, we want to be called Black, right? And basically a progressive liberal's perspective in America is whatever you want to be called is what you should be called. So, okay. And I had to then school my parents to call these folks Black instead of colored. They didn't get it, mostly. But I was, because I was white and liberal, I thought I was instructing my poor dear parents. And the other interesting thing he said was that in 1954, it was, let me double check that date. No, it was 1930, they changed it. And when they decided they wanted to change the name of the denomination, this lecturer said it was a very close vote in the assembly. People weren't ready to give it up, even in 1930. So that's it. It had a lot of emotional connection for folks. So now another piece of this connection, I want to call your attention. Two things I want to call to your attention for. One is the connection between something we talked about last week, and that was the Great Awakenings, the religious revivals in America in the 1770s and then the early 1800s. There were two of them, big national camp meetings all over the place. People getting preached at, being told they had a choice to be saved or not be saved, and they could turn their lives over to Jesus and be saved. And a lot of Black folks got converted to Christianity in those things because they recognized, as we talked about this time, they recognized this emotional connection that to the faith that they fit in with their African heritage. It talked about baptism, and that reminded them of their water rituals in their traditions in Africa. And it also said to them, you are free to decide. It's not because your master says you should become a Christian or not. It is because God wants you to know you are beloved and God gives you the choice. You can decide for yourself. That's a sense of freedom.
It was the first time they also acknowledged the suffrage in the Bible and what would happen to those who had faith and still remain faithful through suffrage. So it acknowledged their pain and suffering as slaves.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So that appealed to folks. Now, here's the interesting piece. And I want you to think about this, and we'll talk about it some more on Wednesday. The emphasis, which was a new emphasis in America, was you need to make a choice to be saved. The main Protestant denominations before that, the Episcopalians, the Presbyterians, the Lutherans, and to some extent the Methodists before that, they were just about you're either a Christian or you're not Christian. That's just, that's just it. In fact, it was Calvin who said, God's already decided. You're going to be a Christian or you're not going to be a Christian. And it was called double predestination. God's decided who's going to go to heaven and who's going to go to hell. There's no freedom in that, by the way. And that didn't appeal. Here, all of a sudden, the Great Awakenings come along, and the Methodists really bought into this, as did the Baptists. They'd bought into the sense of choice and getting saved. Now, I want you to be able to talk with me next Wednesday about what does it mean to be saved? How does that work? And what's the existential, metaphysical, theological workings that make a decision on God's part to say you're okay with God, or makes a decision on your part to make sure you're okay with God, however that works. What ideas about salvation are preached in the churches you know of? And what I'm going to ask you to think critically about is how much of that notion of salvation that you're used to hearing is a truly Black experience, and how much of that is a complete carryover from white religion, white European religion. And we'll talk about that some more.
Wow.
Now we're going to talk about, we're really going to talk about what is a truly Black faith, and how much of it is carried over from colonial European notions. And what I understand, my conversations with my Black preacher friends, is there's still some remnants of white theology in black church religion, and how much of that is helpful and how much is not. I'm going to talk about theories of atonement is what we're going to talk about specifically on Wednesday. This comes out of the Great Awakenings. It comes out of what you saw in Pin and Pin about all three of these denominations are talking about converting former slaves or slaves themselves to Christianity and calling it saving them, saving their souls. In order to understand this historical phenomenon and the development of these churches, I think you need to understand that one basic religious understanding. Now, have I lost you completely? Does this make any sense?
Interesting class.
Say what, Walter?
I said Wednesday is going to be a very interesting class.
Yeah, don't miss it, man. You may even discover.
We just want to argue.
Not me.
No, Dr. Sawyer just want to argue.
You may discover that your old white professor's a heretic. And guess what? As a professor, I'm free to do that. And since I'm no longer an active minister in a Presbyterian church, nobody can get me for it. It's okay.
Well, at least you ain't acting like the professor in Back to School with Rodney Dangerfield.
Oh, yeah? Okay. So now, I'm going to see if we'll see if we can get some more stuff from Walter and from Gary, who's been studying this stuff on Wednesday as well.
See, now you got me ready to rewrite my whole paper again.
You asked me to do that, so it's all right.
It's just so, that's why I said it's so much information, and then now I've been sitting back here debating, okay, I need to take half of what I put in that paper out and go in a different direction. You're making me have second thoughts.
That's the trouble with the meddling old professor. He's making you think. Next, I'm going to ask you to think about things.
Yeah.
A little thinking. Remember that?
Oh, yes.
So the other piece is we're going to kind of get to a little bit, if we get time, to talk about there are three major cultural, political realities in America that affect the life of the Black church. The first one we've talked about some, and that's the Great Awakenings, the revivals. The second we're going to talk about is Reconstruction and Jim Crow. Have really impacted the way the Black church has been able to operate in the United States. And the third one is, have you heard of the Great Migration?
Yes.
That is another piece that has changed the face of Black religion in America. And we would need to be thinking about that. We'll probably get that more when we talk about the Pentecostals, because that comes later, later toward the end of the 1800s and into the 1900s. And then the Great Migration continues through the 1940s primarily. But those three pieces are, they're not so much, they're alluded to in Pin and Pin, but you need to kind of have that in mind as, you know, I'm always trying to pull in what's happening in the world that connects with what it is we're studying. Connections, you know, precursors, consequences, things that connect with other things. Those are all the kind of pieces that I'm trying to pull together here. Now, I've thrown a bunch of stuff at you. You may be shell shocked, I don't know. We can just get Maya to shut up. She just talks.
Throne, how about back the dump truck up and poured it on us?
Say what?
How about you back the dump truck up and poured it on us?
Yeah. Well, it's everything I talked about today primarily is in Pin and Pin. It's all right there. I'm just telling you what to pull out.
Okay.
I'm the little machine in the store where you try to make the thing come down and grab the prize. I'm showing you how to get those prizes.
Oh, okay. Because I used to hate them machines in them stores.
I never could do it
either. Grab nothing.
Yeah. All right. Questions or comments about what we talked about today? Here's your chance to argue with me. You want to, Kim?
No, I don't. I just see it. No, no.
Lucretia's always one that's been is gigging me about arguing. She's not here today, so I don't know.
Well, let's pray she's feeling okay.
Yeah. Okay. Walter, I will look for your paper.
Okay, I'm getting ready to probably write another one.
Well, wait till I give some comments about it first.
Okay.
All right. Thank you very much. We're going to call it quits for the day before I ruin you for the rest of the world.
All right, everybody be safe.
Malik, you got any questions? You're muted, pal.
I said I'm working on my paper, like the Pentecostal one. I'm working on that. So
super duper. All right. Cool. Okay. I will see you all on Wednesday.
Yes, sir.
All right.
Thank you, Doctor.
Love you lots. Take care.
Thank you.